Sandra Bennett resides with her husband Tom Bennett in a peaceful neighborhood near Nashville. Tom, a lawyer, often spends long hours at work, fully absorbed in his cases, which keeps him away from home. Sandra, a homemaker, fills her days with gardening and volunteering at a nearby animal shelter. Outwardly, their marriage appears steady, but in truth, they have grown distant over time. Living next door is Christopher, or Chris Douglas, the town's sheriff. Recently divorced, he moved into the area seeking a fresh start. Chris, a good-looking and sociable man, quickly won the admiration of the locals. Yet, beneath his charming exterior lies a deep loneliness and a yearning for companionship. One day, Sandra and Chris cross paths at a charity event. They feel an immediate attraction, leading them to spend more time together, sharing stories about their lives and common interests. Tom notices Sandra's newfound enthusiasm and frequent absences, but dismisses them as related to her volunteer work. Despite her busy schedule, Sandra's life feels monotonous and unfulfilling. Her once passionate marriage has become routine, with Tom's demanding job leaving her feeling alone. She finds comfort in her gardening, a refuge from the emptiness she carries inside. Chris, meanwhile, is grappling with his own loneliness after his divorce. Moving to Nashville was an attempt to escape the painful memories of his failed marriage. Despite his friendly nature and respected role as sheriff, he feels disconnected from the community. The loneliness contrasts sharply with the image he portrays to others. At the charity event, Sandra and Chris meet in a seemingly fateful encounter. Sandra is managing a fundraising booth for the animal shelter, while Chris is there to support the local community. They bond over their mutual love for animals, forming an immediate and strong connection. Their conversation is filled with laughter, as if they've known each other for years. Over time, Sandra and Chris start meeting regularly. They enjoy long walks, share meals, and open up to each other about their struggles and aspirations. Sandra confesses her feelings of neglect and isolation in her marriage, while Chris speaks about his difficulties moving forward after his divorce. Their bond deepens quickly, evolving from friendship into something more intimate. Tom remains unaware of the growing closeness between Sandra and Chris, trusting her explanations for her absences. His work keeps him preoccupied, and he doesn't suspect anything amiss. Sandra, however, feels torn. She struggles with guilt over her feelings for Chris, but cannot deny the happiness and fulfillment she experiences with him, emotions she hasn't felt in years. Chris, too, feels conflicted. Although he knows their relationship is wrong, he justifies it by convincing himself that he deserves happiness after everything he has endured. His feelings for Sandra only grow stronger, and he begins to envision a future with her. The affair becomes an escape for both Sandra and Chris, bringing excitement and a sense of freedom. They take great care to keep their relationship hidden, meeting discreetly and communicating privately. The forbidden nature of their connection adds to its intensity, making it increasingly difficult for them to resist each other. As their relationship progresses, they begin to consider the idea of being together openly. Sandra dreams of leaving her unhappy marriage to start a new life with Chris. Similarly, Chris fantasizes about a fresh start, where they no longer have to hide. However, their growing closeness does not go unnoticed. Neighbors start observing how often Sandra and Chris are seen together, and rumors begin to spread. Tom, still oblivious, starts hearing subtle hints from colleagues and friends that something may be off. Sandra's inner conflict reaches its peak as she fully realizes the gravity of her actions. She loves Chris and yearns to be with him, but the thought of the pain and betrayal she is causing Tom weighs heavily on her. The burden of keeping their affair secret becomes nearly unbearable. Similarly, Chris feels the strain. As a sheriff, he is expected to uphold high moral standards, and the discovery of his relationship with a married woman could have devastating effects on his career and reputation. He feels torn between his duty and his feelings for Sandra, struggling to reconcile the two. Despite their struggles, Sandra and Chris continue to meet in secret, cherishing the time they spend together while Tom remains busy with his work. Their connection grows stronger, and their passion deepens. However, their cautious behavior begins to slip. They start spending more time together and meeting in less discreet places, drawing attention from those around them. One afternoon, Sandra and Chris meet by a secluded lake, far from prying eyes. They talk and laugh, losing track of time. Sandra suddenly realizes she's been away from home much longer than expected. Panicked, she rushes back, preparing excuses for her absence. Tom, engrossed in his work, fails to notice the subtle changes in Sandra's behavior. but the weight of her lies becomes increasingly hard for her to bear. Chris also wrestles with his feelings. As a law enforcement officer, he understands the risks of their affair, but feels unable to resist his growing love for Sandra. He starts dreaming of a life where they can be together openly, though the reality of their situation makes it seem impossible. As the weeks go on, Sandra and Chris become more reckless, meeting in familiar locations and spending longer periods together. One evening, they decide to meet at a diner on the edge of town, hoping to blend in with the crowd. Unbeknownst to them, a neighbor, Linda Harper, is seated a few tables away. Linda notices their interaction and finds it suspicious. Later, she casually mentions it to her husband, who happens to be friends with Tom. Soon, whispers about Sandra and Chris's relationship begin circulating in the tight-knit community. Chris's colleagues at the sheriff's office start noticing his distracted demeanor and frequent absences. Sandra, overwhelmed by guilt, tries to distance herself from Chris, but their bond proves too strong to sever. Each attempt to end the relationship only brings them closer together. Chris, sensing Sandra's emotional turmoil, reassures her that they'll find a way to be together. However, the affair starts taking a toll on his professional life. He becomes less attentive at work, missing crucial details and making uncharacteristic mistakes. Rumors about his involvement with a married woman spread within the department, threatening his career and reputation. One day, Chris is called into a meeting with his superior, Sheriff Mason, who confronts him about his declining performance and the circulating rumors. Though Chris denies any wrongdoing, he leaves the meeting feeling a mix of anger and fear, realizing the risks their relationship poses to both of their lives. Tom begins to notice that something feels off. He observes Sandra's frequent absences and her distracted demeanor, suspecting that she might be hiding something. However, he cannot bring himself to confront her directly. Instead, he decides to hire a private investigator to uncover the truth about her activities. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Tom contacts Michael Porter, a well-known investigator renowned for his discretion and thorough approach, qualities Tom deems essential to get to the bottom of the situation. Tom explains his concerns to Porter, who agrees to take on the case. Porter promptly begins tracking Sandra and Chris, carefully observing their movements. Meanwhile, Chris starts to sense the rising tension. He notices small changes in Sandra's behavior and grows worried that their secret might soon be exposed. His position as sheriff adds complexity to the matter as his colleagues begin questioning his frequent absences and distracted state. Rumors of his involvement with a married woman already threaten to damage his reputation. Porter works diligently, following Sandra to her secret meetings with Chris. He gathers photographs and detailed notes of their interactions. Within a few weeks, Porter compiles a comprehensive report documenting the affair. The evidence is undeniable. Photos of Sandra and Chris embracing, call records, and even video footage of their covert meetings. One evening, Porter delivers the report to Tom. Alone in his study, Tom pores over the detailed account of his wife's betrayal. The images and footage leave no room for doubt. Waves of anger, sadness, and disbelief wash over him as he grapples with the realization of Sandra's infidelity. He feels profoundly betrayed, not only by Sandra but also by Chris, whom he once considered a trustworthy neighbor. The next morning, Tom confronts Sandra. With a steady but pain-filled voice, he presents the evidence Porter collected. Sandra is caught off guard and stares in shock at the photos and videos. The weight of her actions and their consequences becomes strikingly clear. She tries to explain and apologize, but Tom's hurt runs too deep for immediate reconciliation. Chris, too, is forced to face reality. Tom calls him, demanding a meeting. When Chris arrives at Tom's house, he is apprehensive about the confrontation. Tom, restraining his anger, presents the evidence. Chris sees the devastation in Tom's expression and is overwhelmed with guilt and regret. He attempts to justify his actions, but Tom is uninterested in excuses. The confrontation leaves both Sandra and Chris shaken. Sandra must now face the possible collapse of her marriage, while Chris risks losing both Sandra and his career. At work, Chris faces mounting fallout as the rumors about his affair with Sandra spread. His colleagues grow increasingly disrespectful toward him, and Sheriff Mason calls him in for a stern meeting. Mason makes it clear that the department cannot afford a scandal. Chris is given an ultimatum: straighten out his personal life or face disciplinary action. Sandra and Chris, feeling cornered, decide they must take extreme measures to be together. They begin formulating a plan to eliminate Tom, a plan that grows more dangerous with time. Chris, consumed by his obsession with Sandra, pressures her into agreeing. Their discussions take on a darker tone as they debate methods to stage Tom's death as an accident. Leveraging his experience in law enforcement, Chris proposes scenarios that could divert suspicion. Sandra listens with trepidation, her mind clouded by fear and uncertainty. One evening, as they sit in Chris's car parked in a remote area, Sandra expresses her doubts. She confesses her fear of getting caught and her guilt over planning such a terrible act. Chris, sensing her hesitation, reassures her with promises of a future together, free from lies and secrecy. He insists that once Tom is gone, they can openly live the life they've dreamed of. Despite her moral reservations, Sandra reluctantly agrees to move forward with the plan. They settle on staging a break-in gone wrong, believing it to be the most plausible cover story. Chris outlines the steps, including disabling the security system, crafting a solid alibi for Sandra, and ensuring no evidence leads back to them. As the plan progresses, Sandra becomes increasingly anxious. She begins spotting potential flaws in their scheme and grows paranoid about every detail. Her nervous behavior doesn't escape Tom's notice, and he confronts her about it. Struggling to maintain her composure, Sandra fabricates excuses, but Tom's suspicions deepen. Chris, on the other hand, becomes more determined, blinded by his desire to be with Sandra. He takes extra precautions to erase any evidence and keeps pressuring Sandra to stay committed to their goal. The night of the staged break-in arrives. Following Chris's instructions, Sandra disables the security system and prepares the house to look like a robbery scene. She hides in the guest room, clutching her phone, ready to call Chris if something goes wrong. Her heart pounds as she hears faint footsteps approaching, each sound amplifying her anxiety. Chris enters the house dressed in dark clothing and wearing a mask. He moves quickly, staging the scene to make it appear like a burglary. As he nears the master bedroom, he pauses briefly, reflecting on the gravity of his actions. Steeling himself, he opens the door to find Tom asleep, unaware of the looming danger. Just as Chris is about to act, Sandra's phone rings loudly from the guest room. The unexpected noise startles Chris, and Tom wakes up disoriented. Panicked, Chris abandons the plan and flees the house, leaving Sandra to face the aftermath. Fully awake, Tom demands answers from Sandra, who is visibly shaken. She stammers, trying to fabricate a plausible explanation, but Tom's suspicion turns into anger. The following day, Sandra and Chris meet in a secluded park. Chris is furious about the failed attempt, while Sandra feels a sense of relief that Tom is unharmed. She urges Chris to reconsider their plan, insisting they aren't capable of such extreme measures. Chris, however, refuses to let go of their goal, convinced that their future together depends on it. Sandra, emotionally drained and afraid of losing Chris, reluctantly agrees to try again. On November 3, 2023, Chris decides it's time to put their plan into action. The tension between them has been building for weeks, leaving both on edge. Chris believes this night will finally remove the obstacles standing in the way of their life together. Dressed in black and wearing gloves, Chris approaches the Bennett house under the cover of darkness. He picks the back door lock and slips inside silently. Sandra waits anxiously in her bedroom, hearing the faint sound of the door opening. Panic overwhelms her as she realizes what is about to happen. Tom, meanwhile, works late in his study, oblivious to the danger. Chris moves through the house with precision, avoiding creaky floorboards he memorized during previous visits. Reaching the study, Chris takes a deep breath to steady himself before bursting into the room. Tom is caught off guard, barely having time to react as Chris launches his attack. The struggle is intense, but short-lived. Despite Tom's attempts to defend himself, Chris's determination prevails. With a final decisive blow, Tom collapses to the floor, lifeless. Silence falls over the room, broken only by Chris's labored breathing as he stands over Tom's body. Hearing the commotion, Sandra rushes to the study. Sandra arrives just in time to witness a horrifying sight. Chris, his hands and clothes stained with Tom's blood, turns toward her with a grim look. Sandra's face pales as the shocking reality of the situation sinks in. She has just witnessed the brutal murder of her husband. Chris grabs her shoulders, his expression intense and voice pleading. "This was the only way, Sandra. Now we can finally be together." "We had no other choice," he insists, his words urgent as he tries to cut through her stunned disbelief. Trembling, Sandra nods stiffly, her mind overwhelmed by the horror of what has just happened. In the hours that follow, Chris and Sandra work together to make the scene look like a burglary gone wrong. Chris methodically cleans surfaces, erases traces of his presence, and rearranges the room to align with their fabricated story. Sandra, still reeling from shock, follows his instructions like a robot, her actions devoid of emotion. Although she knows what they are doing is deeply wrong, her fear and desperation cloud her ability to think clearly. Once everything is prepared, Chris slips out through the back door, ensuring he leaves no evidence behind. Sandra waits a few moments before making a frantic call to 911. Her voice filled with genuine terror, she reports a break-in and tells the operator that her husband has been attacked. Police arrive quickly and the investigation begins. Sandra plays the role of a grieving widow convincingly. Her sorrow is real, but it is tangled with a deep fear of the crime she has become entangled in. Meanwhile, Chris returns home, his mind racing with thoughts of the night's events. He knows the coming days will be critical and is determined to remain prepared for any scrutiny from investigators or his colleagues. As detectives begin their work, they take Sandra's statement and meticulously examine the scene. Initially, the story of a botched burglary seems plausible, but as they dig deeper, small inconsistencies begin to surface. Sandra's nervousness and Chris's overly composed behavior raise suspicions, but there is no solid evidence linking them to the crime. As time passes, Sandra and Chris maintain their facade. Sandra attends Tom's funeral, surrounded by friends and family offering condolences. She is overwhelmed by guilt, but Chris remains close by, reassuring her that they did what was necessary. His words, however, do little to ease her conscience, as the weight of their actions bears heavily on her. Chris, for his part, continues working as if nothing has happened, interacting with colleagues, including Sheriff Mason, who is leading the investigation. Using his knowledge of police procedures, Chris skillfully avoids raising further suspicion. The strain of their situation, however, begins to take a toll. Sandra becomes increasingly unstable under the pressure. Her guilt and fear eat away at her, and she starts doubting whether they can truly get away with the crime. Chris, noticing her distress, becomes more controlling, demanding that she stick to their story and stay strong. But Sandra's resolve continues to weaken, and she starts to consider confessing, hoping that telling the truth might somehow make things right. The murder of Tom Bennett sends shockwaves through Nashville. The community is horrified by the brutal crime, and the police department is under intense pressure to solve the case quickly. Sandra, wrestling with her guilt and the weight of her involvement, begins to question the choices that have led her to this point. The investigation grows more intense as detectives meticulously examine the evidence. At first, the burglary theory seems plausible, but inconsistencies in Sandra's statements and her anxious behavior start to raise red flags. Meanwhile, Chris continues to act normal, maintaining his typical demeanor both at work and in the neighborhood. One day, while cleaning the house, Sandra stumbles upon a damning piece of evidence, a blood-stained glove that Chris had accidentally left behind during the cleanup. The sight of the glove jolts her into the grim reality of their situation. She realizes she can no longer remain silent and must come forward with the truth. Tormented by guilt, Sandra decides to contact Detective Sarah Connolly, the lead investigator on the case. Sandra arranges a meeting with Detective Connolly at a private location, away from prying eyes. When they meet, Sandra is visibly shaken. She confesses everything: her affair with Chris, the planning of Tom's murder, and her role as an unwilling accomplice. She hands over the blood-stained glove, explaining how it ties Chris to the crime. Connolly listens intently, her expression a mix of shock and resolve. She reassures Sandra that coming forward was the right choice and promises that justice will be served. With Sandra's testimony and the new evidence, Detective Connolly and her team build a strong case against Chris. Armed with a warrant, the police search Chris's home and car, uncovering further incriminating evidence. Among the findings are text messages and emails between Chris and Sandra that outline their affair and discussions about eliminating Tom. Forensic analysis confirms that the blood on the glove matches Tom's, solidifying the case. Chris is arrested at his home, and news of his capture spreads rapidly, leaving the community in shock. Many had trusted Chris as a respected law enforcement officer, and his involvement in such a heinous crime feels like a betrayal. The trial begins, drawing significant media attention. The prosecution presents a compelling case, highlighting the affair, the premeditation, and the overwhelming evidence tying Chris to the murder. Sandra testifies against him, recounting the events leading up to Tom's death and the aftermath. Her testimony proves pivotal. painting a vivid picture of Chris's manipulative behavior and the extreme lengths he went to in order to be with her. Chris's defense attorney attempts to undermine Sandra's credibility, portraying her as a bitter woman seeking revenge. However, the evidence is undeniable, and the jury is unmoved by the defense's arguments. Sandra's emotional testimony, combined with the physical evidence, proves decisive. In the end, Chris is found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict provides closure for Tom's family and the community, though the emotional scars remain. Sandra, having cooperated with authorities, receives a reduced sentence. She is convicted of being an accessory to murder and conspiracy, resulting in a 15-year prison term. The judge acknowledges her remorse and the courage it took to come forward, but stresses the seriousness of her involvement in the crime.